What I'm about to share is one of the darkest, most deeply unsettling memories I carry from my youth. It completely shattered my sense of trust and altered how I view the people around me. Back in 7th grade, I was an awkward, hyper-observant kid who never quite fit in anywhere. I had a tiny, close-knit circle of friends, 3 other guys who were all a bit eccentric. But back then, we were inseparable. There was Julian, Toby, Leo, and me. We spent endless summer afternoons riding bikes and wandering the woods behind our neighborhood. But as middle school dragged on, a subtle, cold shift occurred. Toby and I were slowly, almost unconsciously, distancing ourselves from Julian and Leo. Julian had started acting strangely, staring into space for long stretches, muttering under his breath, and reacting to minor things with an unnatural, flat intensity. That summer, Leo's family invited the 3 of us on a week-long getaway to an old timber property they owned on a remote peninsula in the Pacific Northwest. His family was strangely secretive about the place. Despite knowing Leo for years, none of us had ever heard him mention it before. His parents were cold, distant people who rarely spoke to us directly, but at 13, a week away from home sounded like an adventure. The drive up was suffocating. I had developed a heavy chest cold, and my constant coughing visibly infuriated Leo's dad. Every time I cleared my throat, he would glare at me through the rearview mirror with a look of pure, unadulterated venom. He was an intense germaphobe, constantly wiping down the steering wheel with antibacterial wipes until the car reeked of harsh chemicals. Meanwhile, Toby and Julian sat in the back seat, bickering in hushed, bitter tones over something petty. To reach the property, we had to drive onto a rusted, creaking car ferry across a fog-choked sound. The water was black, smooth as glass, and swallowing everything in sight. The house itself was a sprawling, drafty 3-story wooden home surrounded by dense, towering fir trees that blocked out most of the daylight. The air inside smelled of damp cedar, old paper, and something faintly sour, like spoiled milk. It had an uncanny, dream-like quality to it, a place where time felt distorted. The local town was miles away, consisting of just a few weathered shops. The locals recognized Leo's dad instantly, but instead of warm greetings, they exchanged silent, heavy glances with him whenever we passed. On our 3rd morning, I realized my favorite vintage camera was missing from my backpack. I was obsessed with photography at the time, and losing that camera devastated me. I searched my room, top to bottom. Leo suggested I must have dropped it on the rocky beach, but I was positive I had set it on my bedside table. When I broke down crying in front of Leo's dad, he stared at me with completely lifeless eyes and told me to shut up, stop being weak, and stop ruining the trip. Ashamed, I swallowed my panic. The next evening, another item vanished. A rare, customized brass fountain pen my late grandfather had given me. It was my prized possession, carried everywhere in a felt sleeve. Julian swore he had seen me drop it near the porch, but it wasn't there. Devastated and refusing to cry in front of Leo's father again, I claimed I had a severe migraine and locked myself in the top floor guest bedroom for the night. I fell asleep early out of pure exhaustion, which explains why I woke up sharply at 2:30 a.m. The room was pitch black, save for a thin sliver of moonlight filtering through the blinds. As I lay there, waiting for my head to stop pounding, a sound caught my attention. It was a low, dry, rhythmic whispering. I froze, my body going completely rigid. I held my breath, straining my ears in the freezing air. The voice was barely audible, muttering fast, sharp, unrecognizable phrases in a flat, monotone cadence. It sounded like someone rapidly reading a list of words backward. The sound was coming directly from Julian's bed across the dark room. I was paralyzed by a deep, primal fear. I wanted to yell, to reach for the lamp, but my muscles refused to move. I lay there in complete terror for what felt like hours, listening to that breathless, rhythmic muttering until my eyes finally heavy-lidded and I slipped into an uneasy sleep. The next morning, the sun did nothing to dispel the gloom. I tried to convince myself the whispering was just a lingering nightmare. Around noon, while Leo, Toby, and I were kicking a ball around the damp grass in the yard, Julian silently excused himself to use the washroom. 20 minutes passed. The air grew heavy and quiet. For some reason, an instinct made me stop and look up at the dark attic window on the 3rd floor, a room that was supposed to be nailed shut, framed by the dust. Covered glass was Julian. He was standing completely motionless, his face pressed flat against the window pane. His hands were dangling uselessly at his sides, his eyes wide open, unblinking, staring straight down at me with a hollow, vacant smile. My heart dropped into my stomach. I blinked, rubbing my eyes, and when I looked back up, the window was empty. That evening, Leo's dad announced he was taking everyone into town for dinner. Still shaken to my core, I pretended my fever had returned and begged to stay behind. Once their car pulled down the gravel driveway, leaving me in the heavy, silent house, an overwhelming compulsion took over. I needed to know what was happening. I walked into the bedroom and opened Julian's heavy duffel bag. My stomach violently churned. Tucked beneath his folded clothes was my missing vintage camera, my grandfather's brass fountain pen, and a horrifying collection of my personal items I hadn't even realized were gone. My spare house key, a silver chain my sister gave me, a pair of my worn socks, and a small pair of nail clippers my mom had packed for me. Beneath the stolen items lay a thick, leather-bound sketchbook. I picked it up, my hands shaking violently. To this day, I regret opening it. The pages were filled with violent, frantic charcoal drawings. The strokes were so deep and aggressive that the paper was torn and shredded in multiple places. There were detailed nightmare depictions of gruesome accidents, grotesque creatures standing over mutilated bodies, and human figures with their faces heavily scribbled out in dark, thick lead. Then I turned to the back section. Every single page was dedicated entirely to me. There were dozens of detailed sketches showing my face contorted in screams. One page depicted me bound to a crude wooden frame, my limbs drawn backward at impossible broken angles. The page after that consisted entirely of my full name, written hundreds of times in microscopic, overlapping handwriting until the paper was practically black. And then came the final page. My name was scrawled at the very top in large, jagged letters. Beneath it were 4 words written in thick, crimson ink. I do it tonight. Panic seized my chest so hard I couldn't breathe. Right then, the heavy crunch of tires sounded in the driveway outside. The family was back. In a frantic blur, I stuffed the stolen items back into the bag, but in a split-second decision born of sheer self-preservation, I tore the final page out of the sketchbook and shoved it deep into my pocket. When Leo's dad walked through the front door, I cornered him in the kitchen, away from the other boys. My voice cracked as I handed him the crumpled, torn page and explained what I had found. His face instantly drained of all color. His eyes widened, staring at the paper in absolute horror. Without saying a word to Julian, Leo's dad walked into the living room, slammed his hands together, and announced in a trembling voice that there was a severe family emergency, and we were leaving immediately. The 3-hole ride back in the dark was a nightmare. Julian sat in the far corner of the back seat, completely motionless, staring at the side of my neck the entire night. He didn't blink. He didn't speak. I could feel his breath cold against the side of my face. After dropping Julian off at his home, Leo's dad pulled the car over, turned around and looked at me with severe eyes, demanding that I never mention a single detail of this night to my parents or the authorities. The moment I stepped through my front door, I collapsed into my mother's arms and sobbed hysterically, telling her everything. Furious and horrified, my parents called the police that exact minute. When the officers arrived, I handed over the torn sketchbook page. That single piece of paper was enough for them to obtain an emergency search warrant. When the police raided Julian's home, they found the sketchbook, along with dozens of missing items belonging to other kids at our school. Julian was immediately institutionalized and removed from the district. His family packed up their house in the middle of the night and vanished. I never saw him again. I thought the nightmare was buried forever, but 2 weeks ago, nearly 12 years after that fateful night, I received an unmarked, thick envelope in my mailbox. Inside was a small piece of yellowed paper with 4 typed words. I remember everything, Sam, and wrapped tightly inside that paper was my grandfather's brass fountain pen, clean, polished, and working perfectly. I've already alerted the FBI, put my apartment on the market, and installed security cameras. But every time I close my eyes at night, I still hear that dry, frantic whispering in the dark.